It was Jaguar's champion at Le Mans, a master of speed, and also tragically a master of death. Maybe that's where the D comes in the name. The Jaguar D-Type. The D-Type is an evolution, a follow-up, if you will, to their first Le Mans effort, the C-Type. The C-Type in itself was a racing version of the XK120, the fastest production car in the world at the time. And it was a pretty brilliant machine. The C-Type won Le Mans twice, in 1951 and 1953, thanks to a revolutionary disc braking system. It was so much faster than its competition, it became the first car in Le Mans history to average over 100 miles an hour over the course of 24 hours. With that much success, Jag knew they had some big shoes to fill, and with their disc brakes trick out of the bag, they turned to another innovation. The aluminum monocoque chassis. Technically it was only the cockpit tub that was designed like that, and then they bolted the front and rear subframes to it, but it still saved a colossal amount of weight. I mean, at that point in time, the only vehicles on Earth that were using that technology were airplanes. And that was not the only aeronautical piece of tech on the D-Type. The fuel tank was an aviation division bag, and the body was co-designed by Malcolm Sayer, the aerodynamic engineer who would go on to co-design the E-Type. And in the aerodynamic world, a thinner profile is better, so the lower the car is, the faster it goes. So Sayer dropped the hood line by putting the 3.4-liter straight six at an 8.5-degree angle. Now that offset meant that there was a slight bulge in the hood, but they could still drop the overall hood line by over an inch, which makes a massive difference. And it meant it had a top speed of 173 miles an hour, which meant they added a rear fin to add some stabilization down the Mulsanne Straight. And they needed that, because when you're going 12 miles an hour faster than the next fastest Ferrari, you're going to want to be in a straight line controllably. And it was a racing tour de force at Le Mans. On its debut, it finished second overall, less than a lap behind the leader, despite having to rebuild its fuel filters mid-race. Now, that is a very incredible achievement, despite the rocky start for the Jaguar division, having to rebuild your car in the middle of the race, but that was nothing compared to the next 2 years of boulder fields. Because we have to talk about 1955. Mercedes had introduced their 300 SLR earlier in the year, so Jaguar added some longer noses and bumped the power up to 270 horsepower, but it wouldn't be necessary. By lap 35, Jaguar driver Mike Hawthorne was charging up in the front, and then his team signaled him to pit. Now, that's a perfectly normal thing, but he saw at the last minute and swerved into the open pit lane, because back then the pit lane was connected to the main road. There was no separating wall, there was no slowdown lane, it was just the racetrack and then the pits. Now when Hawthorne swerved into his pit stall, he cut off the Austin Healey of Lance Macklin, who had to swerve out of the way. And he swerved right into the path of a 300 SLR driven by Pierre Levesque. Levesque had no time to react, and crashed into the back of the Austin Healey, which acted as a ramp and launched the SLR into the berm, where it exploded in half. The magnesium body stayed on the berm, burning for hours because firefighters sprayed water on the magnesium fire. Unfortunately, the engine, the front axle, and the front suspension did not stay on the berm. They flew into the grandstands for 100 meters. And because of the way the grandstands were laid out, it plowed through the spectators with horrifying ease, and the hood flew even further, decapitating spectators as it went, When the dust finally cleared, 84 people were killed and another 178 were wounded. Somehow, because the 1950s are effed up, they didn't cancel the race, although Mercedes did withdraw, which meant that Hawthorne and Jag kept going, and they were all smiles on the podium because they had won, but as the French newspapers put it, congratulations, Hawthorne. And they put a picture of him smiling with the headline 78 to 84 people killed underneath it. Now, Hawthorne wasn't at fault, technically. The massive death toll was due to a racing incident and track design, not any particular driver. Now, if you're one of those people that thinks Hawthorne got off scot-free, you might find some twisted solace in that he died 3 years later off the track when he crashed his Jag Mark I trying to overtake a Mercedes 300 SL. After their disastrous and bloody win in 1955, Jaguar and Hawthorne returned to Le Mans, and they secured the pole position in 1956 by over 10 seconds. And then for some karma, because they hadn't suffered anything, really, at Le Mans last year, everything fell apart at the Jaguar in-house shop. 2 out of 3 of the factory cars broke down or crashed. The lone survivor finished 6th overall, but luckily, Jaguar had a privateer division, which had supplied 53 privateers with D-Types over the last year and a bit for competition, and it was indeed a privateer from Edinburgh who won the 1956 Le Mans in his D-Type. In fact, it wasn't until 1957 that things began to turn around at the Jaguar factory. They had a new 3.8-liter straight six, which was both fast and reliable. The 306 horsepower engine and the super slippery bodywork meant it had top speed in excess of 185 miles an hour. It completely dominated the 1957 Le Mans, sweeping 5 out of the top 6 positions. This was the D-Type's last hurrah, in many ways. The new 3-liter engine regulation in 1958 spelled an end to the dominance of the D-Type, although it was used in local events up until the 1960s. And it would be Jaguar's last Le Mans victory until 1987, 30 years later. But the D-Type did its part. In fact, it won so much that it helped Jaguar become the 4th most successful Le Mans manufacturer in history. Small wonder then that a 1955 example sold for nearly $22 million in 2016. Now, after the 3-liter regulations canned the D-Type program, and Jaguar sports car racing as a whole, they noticed they had a bunch of unfinished D-Type chassis lying around and decided to recoup some of their investments by making it a road car. It was called the XKSS. It didn't actually take that much work, to be honest, relative from taking a race car to a road car, probably because there were no regulations back then for road cars. So they added a passenger door, a folding roof, and a nice interior. It did have a different engine, a 3.4-liter straight six, making 250 horsepower, but it weighed a singular ton, which meant a 0 to 60 in 5.2 seconds at a top speed of 142 miles an hour. It was one of the fastest cars in the world at the time, but it was not a production car. No. Only 25 were scheduled, which doesn't help its production status, and only 16 of them got built because a fire broke out and burned them all down. So, they had a whole bunch of unfinished cars that were nothing more than heaps of burned out rubble. Until 2016, when Jaguar announced they would finish the 9 remaining XKSS's. And this was not some retro mod schmoes, you know. This was a proper job. They got the original blueprints with the original materials and made a 1-to-1 perfect replica, as if it was made in 1957. So it wasn't a kit car. It wasn't based off an F-Type. It wasn't based off of anything. It was the original aluminum with the original rivet positions down to the millimeter. So it was brand spanking new, but old. Now, they cost $1 million because doing that is not a cheap system, if you will believe it. And technically, they aren't road legal because they're following 1957 lack of regulations. Only they're built in 2016, so there's a bit of a thing. You could probably get away with licensing them as a historic vehicle, but it's tricky to justify purchasing them, apart from the fact that if you have $1 million to blow, I don't think you care. And you know what? It worked. They sold all of them very quickly, so much so that they thought, we can make a business out of this. So they did the same thing to the D-Type as well, the proper one, the racing one. Because Jaguar had 100 VIN numbers set aside, but only built 75 D-Types. So, at a price of $1.4 million, you could buy a brand new original D-Type. And you could have it as a long-nosed version with a 3.8-liter engine, or the traditional 3.4-liter engine. Basic model, if you will. If there's a base model for a brand new historic D-Type. Now, like the XKSS continuation, they only filled up the VIN number, so only 25 were built. That's the weird thing about these continuation vehicles. There's not a specific, we're only going to build this amount for every single car. It depends on the vehicle. So they built continuation E-Type lightweights. I think they made 10 of those. Then they made 9 XKSSs. They made 25 D-Types. Which means that not only could you technically buy a brand new D-Type in 2017, you can still see them race, because since they're such historic vehicles, people have actually well maintained them. They keep them in proper working order, which means that places like Goodwood at the historic FIA championships, you can see proper D-Types race. I mean, hell, I saw a Maserati Birdcage. It's the same thing. It's amazing that these machines still work, 70 years later, near enough. But that is the stigma that these cars had. They're phenomenal in their longevity, the speeds they reach, and the things they accomplished, even with the slightly disastrous, not slightly, but serious consequences, are nothing short of legendary. And that's how I would describe the D-Type, and arguably more so the XKSS, because people always forget about that. Even though it was owned by Steve McQueen, which automatically makes it cool, these two cars were, well and truly, legends.